back to the actual news of the day, you may have heard that Trump's trade war has continued to escalate, and unfortunately, it's not really 100% yielding the results that he was sort of hoping for there. So, GM has decided that they are going to move several jobs to China, and Trump has just been absolutely furious about this whole thing. He went on a Twitter tirade. He's talked about it in public. He does not like the fact that GM is going to be moving a lot of their factories and a lot of their jobs overseas, which is understandable. Not saying that it's completely unjustified, but when they announced that GM is going to be laying off about 15% of its labor and shuttering about 5 of their plants in North America to China and other places around the world, especially because it was China, because, Trump, China, he really doesn't like China. So the fact that it was moving to China just, I think, stung a little extra. And that's one of the reasons that the president really did not like that. So one of the things that he did was he threatened the other day that if this took place, what he was going to do is pull subsidies. And what he was specifically referring to is Chevy and GM, because, of course, they're all one company. They're receiving certain subsidies for electric cars, like the Chevy Volt. And here's the thing. I'm for him pulling the subsidies, but not as a retaliation for moving abroad. He should be pulling the subsidies regardless. If GM says, you know what, we are going to stay in America, Trump should still say, yeah, you're still not getting subsidies. The idea that we would be subsidizing electric cars is stupid. It's an Obama-era policy, and by the way, it's not just Obama. George W. Bush did the bailouts too, and so they were bailing out the auto industry. And this idea that we ought to be subsidizing electric cars is beyond dumb. Because here's another thing. Who are the vast majority of those buying electric cars? Now, there are exceptions to this rule, of course, but it's primarily rich people. And so what's hilarious about this is that Barack Obama, the guy that was all for redistribution of wealth and helping the middle class, and we should be using our taxpayer dollars to help people, the cars that he was subsidizing were cars that were purchased by rich people. That's how much, it makes no sense whatsoever. So instead of subsidizing, a Toyota, or subsidizing a Hyundai, or a car that I would even be fine with American cars. If we were subsidizing something like, a Chevy Malibu, that would be one thing, because that's something that a person that may not necessarily be making all that much money. I'm against subsidies altogether. You guys know that. But at least then it would be subsidizing cars that people that are poorer tend to buy. You're subsidizing cars that are basically just luxuries for the rich. It makes no sense whatsoever, and yet we continue to do it because we're continuing on the Obama-era policy of doing so. And let's be honest about this. This is one of the reasons that corporate welfare is stupid. All it does is stave off the inevitable. When we were actually funneling government money into GM and into Chrysler Dodge, they were reaping the benefits of free taxpayer money, or at least, at the very least, a loan at very low interest rates. To subsidize a company, all that did was stave off the job loss. It was always coming. And for that exact same amount of money, we probably could have just paid the people to work for the government at that point. This is the reason that corporate bailouts don't work, and that corporate welfare is stupid. Because all it does is put a Band-Aid on the problem at great cost to the taxpayer, probably greater cost to the taxpayer than it would be to just let whatever it was that was going to happen. And so if you're saying, well, you can stay in this country because we want the jobs, but we're going to pay you this much for the jobs, well, that doesn't make any sense. We could just pay the people to have jobs here, whether in the government or something else, for that amount of money. Or we could just let the free market actually do what it's supposed to do and restructure those companies and allow jobs to go overseas, which creates more jobs in other sectors. For example, nobody likes the idea of outsourcing, but there are certain ways where it's economically beneficial and it helps with jobs. So if you're importing all kinds of new products from other countries, well, somebody's got to ship it over here. And somebody's got to be a retailer, because if you don't have retailers, then you're not going to be able to sell the product here anyway. And if you're doing so at a lower price, that means you can hire more retailers, you can buy more advertising, whatever else it is that you want to do. And so this trying to curtail and trying to embrace this idea of protectionism, that we're going to try to keep these jobs in the United States, that keeps other jobs from being made in other sectors. It doesn't make any sense. Because now we are losing jobs that we would have in other parts of the economy that would be a better allocation of scarce resources, which is really what economics is when you boil it all down. It is the allocation of scarce resources that have alternative uses. That's really all it is. And what we're doing is we're taking resources and using them in an inefficient way, funded by the government, to prop up a failing business or to prop up a business to engage in activities that cost more. Because if they didn't cost more, then they wouldn't be doing them. And so we're intentionally making things cost more for no reason. And here's another thing. Part of the reason that GM is doing this is because of the high steel tariffs. Because if they're operating in China, then they can get steel at a cheaper price. GM has already estimated, since the tariffs have been put into place, which didn't even begin until almost the middle of this year, just since then they've already lost $1 billion. Because when steel goes up, their prices go up. The price of a car goes up. And when that happens, demand drops, which means you sell less cars. And so GM has already lost, to their estimation, over $1 billion in steel tariffs. This is why tariffs are stupid. Because yes, it props up one business, but it does so at the expense of everybody else. The only person that wins in tariffs is the government because they get tax money out of it. That's it. You pay more for your products, and it costs jobs. Everything that's associated with the market distortion happens because of tariffs. Everything that's associated, just like any other market distortion, whether it's raising the minimum wage, whatever else it may be, tariffs do exactly the same thing, usually worse, actually. So this is not all President Trump's fault. I'm not trying to lay GM moving all at his feet because, like I said, Barack Obama and George W. Bush played a large role in it. And it does kind of suck that we invested about $1 trillion into these companies. I think it was $1 trillion overall if you're looking at them and Chrysler. And then GM's just like, nope, we're good. See ya. We're out. Well, then what was the point of us propping you up in the first place? And again, that's exactly why corporate welfare is dumb, because you don't always see an adequate return for your investment. And at best, it just slows down the problem. It doesn't actually stop it. So you have a slowed down problem that still winds up occurring anyway, and you spent all this money to do it. It's a horribly inefficient way to try to bolster an economy, and usually does the exact opposite, which we're seeing right now. So here's another issue, because Trump is really upset about this, and he's talking about trade deficits. Well, trade deficits in and of themselves are not bad. I've said this, I don't know how many times. You know what country has a massive trade deficit right now? America. You know what country has a massive trade surplus right now? Venezuela. So obviously a trade deficit or a trade surplus is not in and of itself a measure of whether or not we have good trade deals or bad trade deals, or whether or not our economy is strong or weak. Because obviously we're getting an awful lot of money. And that means we're spending a lot of that money overseas for products, which means we have a trade deficit. If you go out and buy gasoline from your local gas station today, unless you sell them something, you have a trade deficit with the gas company. Why? Because you've determined that the money in your pocket is worth less to you than the gasoline that you could purchase for said money. Ergo, you engage in a free market trade where you say, I want gas, you have gas, here's the money, give me some gasoline. And the other guy essentially says, okay, because I have gas and I'd rather have your money than the gasoline that I have, so I'll take your money. And then you engage in that trade, and then you both go off on your merry way, both feeling like you won. That guy feels like he won because he got the sale and he got the money that he wanted. You feel like you won because you got the gasoline that you needed. Ergo, both of you walk away from that trade feeling like you got the better deal. That's the way a mutually beneficial trade is supposed to work. Trump, unfortunately, has this weird idea that trading is a zero-sum game, and if you're winning, then the other guy's losing and vice versa. And so he feels like if you're engaging in trade, there's a winner and a loser in this case. And that is not the way that trade works. And unfortunately, he has carried this over. But despite all this, because he was complaining about trade deficits and saying, we have to drive down the deficit, we have to get to where we're not importing nearly as many goods. Well, ironically, the trade deficit went up after his tariffs. This is according to a report. Deficits are not necessarily a bad thing at all, and I understand that. I agree with that. I don't think that the trade deficit going up is necessarily a bad thing. But the whole goal of his tariff plan was to lower those deficits. And for 5 straight months now, we've had a growth in the deficit, and it is expected to hit we're going to hit a deficit high by New Year's. So clearly, not only are the tariffs not making the economy better, they're not even doing what Trump promised they would do. Which, if the deficits is lowered, that would be neither a good thing or a bad thing. It just depends on which trades we're making. But even though I don't have a problem with the deficit being high, even Trump, who said that that was the whole purpose of tariffs in the first place, has seen deficits rise for 5 months straight and is about to hit a record high, deficits we've never seen before. There is a $1 billion deficit growth in October and $200 billion after those $200 billion worth of tariffs started in China. So we've had over $1 billion in deficit growth. Now, granted, possibly part of the reason for this is it was exasperated by Trump's threat to hike tariffs, and that's no longer on the table, which is good, because it means that right now what's happening is that because of this new development, that Trump has said we're going to put a pause on the tariffs. He met with President Xi. I like to call him President 11 because his name is XI. But President Xi, he met with him the other day and said, we're going to take 3 months, put a pause on the tariff hikes from 10% to 25%, and we're going to try to sort this out. I hope that's a good sign. I hope that means that we're going to wind up bringing down trade barriers with China. And one thing that he has talked about, which I do applaud the president on, I do think that he's doing the right thing on, is he talked about intellectual property rights with China. Now that is a big deal because China has essentially no respect for copyright laws. And when America invents something and they try to bring that product into China, they basically say, well, you can bring it in here if you want to, but if you do, we're not going to protect your copyright laws, and anybody that gets their hands on it can mass produce it and sell it to the Chinese. Which makes it much harder for American companies to actually turn a profit when expanding into markets like China. Because people will make a knockoff that's exactly the same as your product that they did no research for, that they didn't have to develop themselves, and so they can undercut you on cost. And that's not fair. That's not right. And so one of the things that Trump has talked about is trying to get that fixed. And now if he does that, that's a big win. And that's a big win for free trade and the free economy. But, let's see if that takes place. If it does, excellent. I'm all for it. But right now, I'm skeptical. I'm cautiously optimistic. We'll say it that way. I want to err on the side of being optimistic, and we'll try that. So Trump has a new trade deal out that he announced and signed just the other day called the USMCA, which is going to be the replacement for NAFTA, which was signed at the G20 summit just this weekend. Now, technically, even though all 3 presidents, well, I say that, the president of the United States, of course, the president of Mexico, and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, they all signed it, but in all 3 of the countries, it still has to pass their legislatures. So in none of the 3 countries that signed is it actually law. This is just an agreement reached by the executives of those countries. So what we're going to see in the coming days is Congress, if they're going to approve it or not. And technically, it's still going to have to clear that hurdle in all of the countries to be official. But Trump has called NAFTA, quote, the worst trade deal ever made in the history of the world. And the irony in all of that is, all 3 countries greatly benefited and saw economic increase after NAFTA went into effect. Specifically, with goods and services that were traded across borders. And so actually what NAFTA did was it lowered trade barriers in all countries, and all countries saw an economic boost in it. Mexico has seen an increase in quality of life. America has done the same thing. Canada saw it open up in new markets. They had all kinds of new markets that they could go into, specifically things like timber. And so they were making all kinds of money on all three fronts. And that's the way a mutually beneficial trade deal should look like. And here's the irony in all this. Despite Donald Trump saying that it was one of the worst trade deals in all of human history, he basically just made NAFTA 2.0. His new agreement, which is supposed to be a replacement for NAFTA, which is this horrible deal. According to, it's terrible, it's horrible, it's the worst. It's supposed to be this horrible deal, and yet President Trump's version of the deal is 90% the same. That's according to an economist named Gary Huffbar, who is he's not a left-winger or anything. The guy's a free trade economist. He likes free markets. He's a big C capitalist. And he's saying, yeah, I'm looking at the deal and it's 90% what NAFTA was. There's some tweaks and there's some things that are different, but by and large, it's just NAFTA. And so it is really funny. President Trump has spent all this time talking about how terrible NAFTA is, and his law or his deal that he came up with is essentially exactly the same. So let's talk about a handful of the things that are different. One thing it did do is it did lower some tariffs on some ag commodities like dairy in Canada, which you may remember we talked about Friday. Well, that's a really good thing, but the primary beneficiary of that is Canada. Again, not a problem for me. That's mutually beneficial. We get to sell more of our dairy in their country. Their people get to pay less money for dairy. It is a win-win. And so I'm perfectly okay with that, but it's ironic that it didn't really hurt American farmers that much because there were other buyers that were willing to get our dairy and our other products. And so bringing down those trade barriers primarily helped Canada, not us. But that's fine. I'm okay with that. It's funny that Trump is touting this as a huge win for America. And it also raised the amount, and this one I'm really having problems with. It also raised the amount of auto parts manufactured here from 62.5 to 75%. So now, under this new deal, 75% of cars sold in the United States have to be manufactured here in America. That's an arbitrary, unnecessary regulation on the auto industry. There's no reason that should be the case. 75%, that's ridiculous. And 40 to 45% of the car must be made by high-wage people earning $16 per hour or its equivalent. Again, this is really stupid. It makes just as much sense as having a minimum wage hike to $15 an hour. Having a market distortion like that and artificially saying this is what your labor must be worth to you doesn't make any sense. People will pay what the labor is actually worth. And when they do so, it is going to benefit all parties involved. But up until that point, the idea that the government can somehow mandate that certain jobs have to pay this amount or this amount of the product has to be made by people making this much money, no, they will pay what it is worth to them or that job will cease to exist. And eventually, when these market distortions come into effect, that's exactly what happens. That those jobs that you cannot anymore hire somebody for less than that amount, they just wind up not hiring that person. And so instead of somebody making $14 an hour, they make $0 an hour. How is that an improvement? Then they just don't have a job. And so people have less products that they're paying more money for, and there are people that would have had a job otherwise that now don't have a job. This is why market distortions and things like minimum wages are so incredibly stupid. Because it takes a lot of free will and economic freedom out of the marketplace. It also, this deal increased imports of quotas by eggs and poultry products. Again, I don't understand the whole thing of quotas, that you have to import this amount. If Canadians want our products, they're going to buy more of them. If they don't, they won't. Quotas really doesn't help us in any significant way. And this really all goes back to one principle that neither Donald Trump nor most Democrats, and Republicans for that matter, really do not understand. Centralized planning is no replacement for a free market. There is no way that a bunch of bureaucrats in Washington can accurately predict the behavior of 320 million people. They just can't do it. And so leaving that to the free market and allowing prices to dictate how the market moves is a far more efficient system. It does for free what it cost us millions of dollars to try to get people in Washington to do, and it does it better. And so this idea that somehow these elites in DC, and I'm including Trump in this, that these elites in DC can get together in a room and decide what people will buy and what people won't buy and how much of it they're going to buy and how much of it they're going to make here and how much of it they're going to make there. A market does that all for free, and it does it more efficiently. Centralized planning is no replacement for that. It never has been, and it never will be, because it cannot predict all the eventualities of the future, and it also cannot predict people and what they want and how they want to spend their money. And because it can't predict that, then we should leave it to the magic of the free market. Trump has threatened to pull out of NAFTA if Congress doesn't approve it. This is just so beyond reason to me. Because what he has said now is because Congress has to approve the New Deal, he says that if Congress does not approve this deal, then he is going to pull NAFTA out, and then we'll just have pre-NAFTA conditions. That is so beyond stupid. That's going to wind up hurting us. That's like saying, I am going to hurt the citizens of this country if I don't get my way. Now, again, I don't think that this is a horrible deal. It's a mixed bag. I think there's some things about it I really like, and there's some things about it that I really detest. But it's certainly not worth hurting the entire country over. It's not worth holding the country hostage and saying, if you don't do this, then we're just going to go back to pre-NAFTA conditions, and we're going to have whatever it was before then, increase in tariffs. That is not going to be good for the economy. I'm not trying to overstate things. I don't think that it's going to destroy the economy or completely derail it or anything like that. But it is going to mean higher cost for everyday products for Americans. And the fact that Trump is willing to even entertain that idea unless he gets exactly what he wants, to me just comes off as childish. You should not be willing to hurt the citizens to get a bill in place that's largely just a cosmetic change. And rest assured, that's actually what Trump really wants. He wants the cosmetic change. He wants to be able to take credit for it, and that's why he wants the name to change. Because once the name changes, then it's really his baby, and he can take credit for it, and he can point to that and say, see, look at this awesome thing that I did, even though it's 90% exactly the same as what we had before. That's really what he wants. He's a marketer. That's the kind of person that he is. And so because of that, he really wants the win, but wanting the win at the expense of other people is just really dumb. Now, to President Trump's credit, he has gotten a little bit better on trade. But it seems to me that he has this unfortunate belief that that tariffs, for whatever reason, are ultimately good. And that's not good, because the tariffs, like we've mentioned, they're starting to take away jobs. They're starting to cost American workers and American consumers. And at the end of the day, it's just much easier and a much better policy to adopt free trade. The president has said in the past that that's his eventual goal. That's eventually where he wants to get to. Hey, if that's true, I'm all for it, and I hope that he gets there. I just do not think that tariffs are going to be an effective way to get us to that point.